Good afternoon and welcome. We're so glad you decided to spend a little time with us this afternoon. My name is Charlie Arnott. I am the CEO of the Center for Food Integrity. And on behalf of our members and our co-host FMI, the Food Industry Association, it's my pleasure to welcome you to another digital dialogue on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the food system. Now, as food and agriculture, we continue to our journey to learn and improve our DEI performance. There's growing appreciation for the business value of having a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable workplace. More diverse companies are more creative. They have better problem-solving skills. They have improved decision-making, increased profitability and productivity, enhanced employee engagement and retention, and a better reputation. In short, supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business. Today, we'll explore DEI and how to more effectively engage multiple generations in your organization. So this is going to be an exciting conversation. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our co-host for this session. Let me get back here. Here we go. My colleague and friend, David Fikes from FMI, the Food Industry Association. David, are you muted by chance?
Oh, sorry. Now it's an official meeting that we've had to use the words get off mute.
There we go.
Again, thank you, Charlie. FMI is so very proud to partner with CFI in hosting the digital dialogues. As part of his stand-up routine, a comedian, Jeff Foxworthy, used to observe that initially when he heard his wife say the words, "We need to talk," well, he would start talking, which infuriated his wife. He admits that it took him a long time to learn that when his wife said, "We need to talk," she really meant, "I need to talk, you need to listen." Well, now it's a lesson for all of us that we need to learn that when there's a real need for dialogue, we need to bring as much energy to the listening side of the proposition as we do to the speaking part. Our species has created all kinds of ways to subdivide and categorize each other by age, by ethnicity, right-handed, left-handed, by birth order, by gender, by political party, and the list just goes on and on and on. So whenever our conversation seeks to reach across any of those established delineations, the ways in which we have sought to classify each other, we need to redouble our efforts to listen. Why? Because when we're speaking from one camp to another group, it's so easy to get defensive, standing up for our own classification, speaking in support of those who are like us. And in that defensiveness, we get much more interested in getting our ideas across than we are invested in hearing the experiences of others. When we get even the least bit defensive, we tend to fail giving proper energy to listening, ensuring that we are hearing and truly understanding the other's perspective. So when it comes to matters of racial justice, well, we need to talk. And these digital dialogues were created for all of us in the food industry to have a safe place to speak, but equally important, they were created for some of us to have a safe space to listen, because for far too long, some of us are guilty of doing most of the talking. And who knows, if we talk honestly enough and listen earnestly enough to each other, we may find that we don't need all those classifications after all. So welcome to the September 222 installment of the Digital Dialogues.
David,
Charlie?
thank you. Always poignant and insightful comments to kick us off. I appreciate helping set the stage for what's likely to be a terrific dialogue today. Now, we do want to hear from everyone that is interested in today's dialogue. Your perspective is important to this conversation as well. So please submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A icon on your toolbar at any time during the conversation. We'll do our very best to get to as many questions as possible. Now, today, I am so thrilled to be able to introduce two people for whom I have the utmost respect and appreciation for who they are and what they do across the food system. They've been great champions of DEI, great champions of engaging in this conversation and encouraging a more productive dialogue about diversity, equity, and inclusion. First, let me introduce Jacqueline Howard. She's a prominent global supply chain executive who spent more than 30 years working for leading consumer brands and such as McDonald's and Starbucks. She's a proven innovator, fearless change agent, passionate people leader, and courageous advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Jackie also serves on the CFI Board of Directors and the Digital Dialogues Advisory Board and a number of other organizations that all make this world a better place. So, Jackie, welcome. We are thrilled you are here. Also today, Graven Solomon. I've had the pleasure of seeing Raven present a few times, and she is inspirational and challenging, and strikes a great balance of being both, which is a wonderful gift to have. She's a global diversity, equity, and inclusion thought leader, a nationally recognized keynote speaker who helps organizations get future ready by understanding generations, racial equity, and their intersection. Raven's mission is very simple: to solve for racial inequity by breaking down generational and racial barriers in the workplace and replacing them with empathy and synergy that fosters productive working relationships, drives business results, and prepares organizations to compete in the not so distant future. Raven is the author of the book, Leading Your Parents, 25 Rules to Effective Multi-Generational Leadership, and host of the podcast, The Generational View. So Jackie, Raven, thank you so much for the time that you're spending with us today. And I encourage everyone to engage heartily, listen fully, and participate in the conversation by submitting your questions or comments as you have them. So with that, Raven, I will turn it over to you.
Sounds good, Charlie. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I know we've been thinking about it for a while, planning it for a while. And so I've got just a lot of information that I want to share with everyone. And I don't know if we'll have time to get to everything, but that's okay. We've got a robust discussion, I think, planned with Jackie. And then again, as Charlie mentioned, feel free to drop your questions that you might have in the Q&A so that we get to as many of those as we possibly can. But you should see my screen now. I want to first just start by sharing my contact information. Sometimes we get to that, sometimes we don't. And so I look forward to connecting with everyone on LinkedIn. You've got my cell phone number here. You've got my email address and all of my social media handles, so that should we not be able to get to your question, you at least have my contact information to reach out. So when we were having a conversation just about what we discussed today, I was posed a couple of questions from Charlie, David, and the teams. And I want to just spend a little bit of time answering those questions at a high level by way of some visuals and just talking with our group today about some of the things I talk to with a lot of my clients. I get the opportunity to speak to about 70 audiences a year as a keynote speaker. And then we do some consulting, some strategic advisory and some coaching with select organizations. And so I get the opportunity to have a lot of conversation, to lead a lot of discussions about this work. And so today, instead of giving you this keynote that I would normally do throughout my travels, I'm going to just share some consensus with you, if you will, from the conversations, dialogues that I have with my teams or my organizations, rather, that I work with, and then also amidst the community of diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals, enthusiasts, and advocates that we've built over the course of a couple of years. So that being said, let's get into a couple of the questions that I've been posed and just some insights that I wanted to share with you, things to think about and consider. So first question was, in terms of corporate initiatives, what would I say is working versus what's not working? And so I want to share with you just a couple of things that I would say are great in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, advancements, the traction that we're seeing, and then not so great in terms of the exact opposite, right? And so the first couple of things I would share around what is working is, quite frankly, really taking an integrated approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy across all functions of the business. And so when it comes to what I believe it takes to truly, I would say, cultivate organizational inclusion and create organizational inclusion, there are a bunch of different things, but I really would break them up and group them, if I could, into 6 elements that I think really are necessary to create organizational inclusion. That first one is kind of 3 technically, but nonetheless, it's commitment, it's strategy, it's alignment, and support, right? So strategy and alignment kind of go hand in hand. But ultimately, what we're talking about there is you need a commitment from the top down to truly do diversity, equity, and inclusion work effectively, efficiently, and productively, right? And so we need that commitment from the top down, but you also need alignment and demonstrated support of a full diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. So this particular element is assuming that you have already done the work to really create and carve out a full diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, which is a huge undertaking and project in and of itself, right? So we've got to have the commitment, we've got to have the strategy and alignment, and then the support, the demonstrated support of said strategy. Secondly, is really all about this I would say, journey to understanding and awareness. This is where we as an organization really create this foundational understanding and awareness of the business case for this work, the moral case for this work, and overall critical elements and terminology around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so that is things like intersectionality. That's things like equity versus equality. That's things like belonging. What do these terms actually mean? And is there a common understanding and awareness across the business that really speaks to those things? So that's number two. Number three, the third element is really all about an educational strategy. So how are we building the skills and the competencies within every level of the organization necessary to truly create culture change and behavior change? I cannot say behavior change enough, right? So you need this educational strategy, which should be a multi-year strategy, right? Fourthly, it's necessary that we have culture change. I alluded to that just a moment ago, but you need and must have this culture of a number of things, including culture of trust and safety, psychological safety, physical safety, wellness, right? Allyship and advocacy. Do we have these things, these elements embedded in our culture? Is there a culture of value and belonging, confidence, inspiration, fairness, and respect, and so many other things? And so it takes this journey towards culture change if your culture already doesn't consist of these many things I've listed on the screen here. Fifthly, it takes an integrated approach, which I've kind of alluded to that earlier. This is where equitable policies, practices, procedures come in throughout every function of the business. And then lastly, it takes accountability. And so when we're talking about integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion across all functions of the business, this is what it takes to truly create organizational inclusion. And it's evident and obvious that one department, i.e. your diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders, cannot accomplish all of this on their own, right? And so it truly is necessary that the strategy is clear across every function of the business, and that is implemented across every function of the business. And so I want to show you just what I would call a key stakeholder ownership model that comes to you from an organization by the name of the Kaleidoscope Group, whom I work with and respect greatly. It really shows you, and I'm going to go through this very quickly, it shows you what we mean by integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout the business. But then also it shows you, hopefully, what your role is as a leader or an individual contributor is in diversity, equity, and inclusion work within your organization. So let's start first with the middle of this chart here. This is where your diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals live, right? Your DEI councils, your leadership teams in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, your facilitators, your CDO, et cetera. Their job, their primary responsibility is to really lay out the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, to provide the roadmap, to set the direction as to where we're going. Right? They also define the critical nature of this work for this particular business, right? So Charlie mentioned getting clear on that business value, right? And then they also set the direction and establish accountability. Where are we going? What happens if we don't do what it takes to get to where we're going? And so that's their role. Then you go to the right-hand part of this chart where we're really focusing on the functions of the business. Their job, your job as a functional leader of an organization, is to integrate that particular DEI strategy into the mainstream processes of your business. So for example, HR and the many different kind of sub-functions of HR all have a responsibility, or should, in driving inclusion and equity within the organization. So think about comps and benefits. Clear rationale, clear opportunity for them and responsibility to create pay equity, for example. So that should be a part of DEI strategy being integrated into the mainstream processes of the business. So that's just an example. Marketing has a role, ops has a role, supplier procurement has a role, etc. Lastly, let's go over to the leadership column, which most of you joining the call probably are. You are either an individual contributor within your organization, or you are a mid-manager, maybe a functional leader. Ultimately, your role is to manage the accountability that's established by our diversity, equity, and inclusion team. You also instill commitment, right? So being super clear on the business value, the moral value of this work and why we're doing this. And then lastly, it's so critical that you are modeling the behaviors set forth by our DEI team and our leadership team in general to actually cultivate inclusion and drive equity. And so those behaviors are numerous. We'll talk a little bit about some of them later on in our conversation today. But this is what we mean by creating an integrated structure, if you will, an integrated approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion across the entire organization. Secondly, things that are working, right? I would say when everyone in the organization owns diversity, equity, and inclusion, meaning they are clear that not only do they have a responsibility in cultivating inclusion, but they're clear on what that responsibility is. And so I want to share with you just a really quick framework that I often use with some of my clients to help them understand the approach that we want to take to really create systems of inclusion throughout the business. And so this comes to you by a couple of organizational psychologists, by the name of Furtman and Dean. But ultimately what they're saying here by way of this image is that in order to create individual experiences of inclusion, which is at the base of this framework, you need inclusive interpersonal interactions, right? So that's where everyone in the organization comes in. It's everyone's responsibility to ensure that we are showing up inclusively in our everyday interactions with one another so that we are actually cultivating an environment of inclusion every day. Then it takes really having inclusive norms and practices and procedures inside of groups and teams, but it also takes leaders and at the highest level and mid-level to really drive inclusive practices. And then it also takes organizational policies, practices, climates, et cetera. And then it also takes a societal prioritization of inclusion. And so what am I saying here? Again, your diversity, equity, and inclusion team, no matter how big it is, cannot accomplish this solely on their own. So each and every one of us has a responsibility in driving one's experience of either inclusion or exclusion. And so the organizations that are doing this work well understand that, and therefore are equipping every level of the organization with the necessary skills and competencies, know-how to truly alter behavior to drive cultures of inclusion. Right? All right, last thing that I would say is working within organizations that I have the privilege of doing some work with. Honestly, I've had the great privilege of being what I would call an inclusive leadership coach. In some cases, we call it a DEI coach to executive leaders. And the value of that is so critical because sometimes your CEO, your CFO, your COO is not going to feel extremely comfortable having conversations about their weaknesses, if you will, their shortcomings, their, I don't knows, if you will, in the area of inclusion and equity within the organization, right? Even if there's a chief diversity officer, there's a certain degree of vulnerability we're asking for from these executive leaders. And sometimes that vulnerability isn't always achievable or accessible within the organization. And so having coaches who are specifically skilled and trained in DEI to really help develop that inclusive leadership muscle within senior leaders is really, really making a difference, creating the safe space for development. That is absolutely critical and necessary. And so I would point to that as something I see is really working and making a difference. A couple of things that are not working is a siloed diversity, equity, and inclusion department or team, meaning you've taken all of the responsibility that I just laid out to you, and you've given that over to a chief diversity officer and 2 or 3 individuals on their team and said, hey, go make us successful. And by the way, we want you to report to HR. We want you to report to someone else, right? Aside from the CEO. This is not working. It's not effective because of what I just described, right? It's everyone's responsibility, and every functional leader has to be clear on what their responsibility is and be skilled to actually achieve said responsibility. And so the siloed approach to DEI functioning all on its own and being responsible for all things is not working. Secondly, a bottom-up approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion I often see is not working as well. What we know is that there is a rise in employee activism across, I think, all industries, which I think you all are very, very aware of, right? And so with the rise in employee activism in some organizations, what's happening is the employees are driving what is needed, if you will, from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. Thus, the leadership is reacting instead of being proactive in leading diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so while we absolutely need the voice of our employees, and we want that, and we should have that, what shouldn't be happening is our leaders, or us as leaders of an organization, aren't doing DEI work until we're made to by our employees. So that's what's not working. Last thing that's not working is this transactional versus transformational approach. The transactional would be, hey, we want to check the box. We want to do a diversity, equity, and inclusion training, maybe even twice a year, 3 times a year, what have you. But we don't really want to make the investment necessary for transformation. So I've lost a client or two, quite frankly, or have stepped away from a client or two when the conversation becomes, hey, Raven, help us operationalize DEI. What does that mean, right? Oftentimes what that means, I'll be honest, is help us make DEI possible within our current frameworks, how we've always done things. To me, that's a transactional approach. What's necessary, unless you've always done things, introspectively first, what's necessary, in my opinion, to really do transformational diversity, equity, and inclusion work is starting introspectively, especially as senior leaders. And that is what is really going to lead to the transformation. So let me just show you a couple of things that I think are really driving the change in the way we need to approach DEI work that will reflect transformation versus that transactional approach. So here's a reality. Diversity, equity, and inclusion work is absolutely changing. It's changing before our eyes, and here's how. It's really moving from this place of solely being legislative to really being voluntary. Organizations shouldn't be doing DEI work because the law says that they should, right? That's a good 50-year-old process or good 50-year-old way to approach this work. What we really should be doing is doing it voluntarily because we're clear on its value. And so that's a major shift. The other major shift is really from being, as I mentioned, reactive to being proactive. We're not doing it solely because our employees said, or solely because we got canceled because someone in the organization made a misstep. We're doing it because we know it's the right thing to do and it's the smart thing to do. And so approaching it proactively is the now level, I would say, of diversity, equity, inclusion. What I see in the future, and really what should be now as well, is this shift from DEI work being majority centered, meaning we're trying to get the majority on board. We're trying to get folks to understand privilege. We're trying to get folks we're really creating and curating policy and practice that really centers the majority, to shifting to really being centering, I should say, the historically marginalized. And so it's less about, hey, how do we do work that makes the majority feel comfortable, and more about how do we do work that centers the need of historically marginalized communities. So that's a major shift, right? Last major shift in the maturation of diversity, equity, and inclusion work that has already happened is really moving us from this place of being solely quantitative, as in counting heads solely, because we do need to being qualitative as well, meaning we're not just measuring representation and diversity, but we are measuring inclusion, right? The experience of employees, consumers, community members, et cetera. Now, how we get to that space of inclusion is equity, from my perspective. So that's a major shift, or the major shifts that I would say are happening within the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. I want to transition just really quickly and talk to you about what I call the generational business case for this work, right? Because when it comes to the maturation of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, a bit of it is quite frankly being driven by some generational differences and some generational experiences. So you see the generations, the living generations that exist amongst us today in the US here on the screen. Susan's going to launch a poll really quickly because I want to show I want to see rather, what's the generational makeup of the folks joining our call today? So you should see that poll pop up on your screen right now. And I want you to quickly cast your vote. Which generation do you identify with? Is it traditionalists? Is it baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, or Gen Z? And you can see the born years here on your screen as well. All right, we're going to keep it open for maybe 5 more seconds. So cast your vote, we'll close it out, and then we'll take a look at the results. All right, results popping up right now. I see, we've matched. Gen X and millennials are tied at 42% apiece. We've got about 13% boomer and about 3%, one person out there of Gen Z. All right, cool. That's good to know. Thank you, Susan. Here are a couple of things about Gen Z that I want to share, and a couple of just trends, quite frankly, that should be very evident, and to me are very evident in the data. If you didn't know, Gen Z is currently the most racially and ethnically diverse generation the US has ever seen. And you can see this shift taking place right here in the chart that I'm showing you from Pew Research. And so they are the most racially and ethnically diverse generation we've ever seen, driving a very different experience that Gen Z is having, right, as it relates to racial difference and ethnic difference. Also driving the expectations that they have of organizations to embrace, welcome, and be inclusive of that difference. So I'll point to that. They are also the most gender diverse generation that we have ever seen. Now, we don't have time to unpack what I mean in depth around gender identity and Gen Z being the most gender diverse generation that we've ever seen. But nonetheless, you can see here, there's a lot of charts going on, but ultimately what these charts are pointing to is the reality that Gen Z is having a much more diverse experience as it relates to gender identity, and their expectations about what we do about those gender differences is higher than any other generation in the workforce today, and quite frankly, in society today. This is really no surprise, I'm sure, to you. I just wanted to show some data, right? I want to point to this chart too, because I think it just high level says something. It says something very clear. Younger generations, just generally speaking, disproportionately, if you will, see diversity as a benefit, a value, a good thing for society in relation to other generations. Now, I'm surprised by these numbers in general across all generations, but nonetheless, we see a trend here, right? This last study was done before we really began tapping Gen Z, if you will, for data. But I want you to just sit with this for a minute. You can just see the trend, right? The younger we go up the generational ladder, or down the generational ladder, I would say, the more folks understand there to be vast differences between racial groups and the experience within society and workplaces, right? And so this is the reality. Couple of more just data points that I want to point to as it relates to the perspective that Gen Z is bringing to the workplace. 51% of Gen Z says that they respect a company more if that company supports racial equality, this study said. We really should have been assessing racial equity, from my opinion, but nonetheless, this study pointed to racial equality. Either way, that's a big chunk of the population. 77%, this is so important for us to understand, folks. 77% of Gen Z workers said that a company's level of diversity, not even inclusion, not even equity, but a company's level of diversity affects their decision to work there. We are engaging with Gen Zers all the time, looking at data, reading research, doing research, and it's all pointing to this reality that they are going to websites before they apply, right? They are looking at board of directors. They're asking pointed questions in interviews about what we're doing in the area of DEI. So what I'm most excited about when it comes to Gen Z is the level of accountability that's going to come for us to really do inclusion work and equitable work. Couple of other things, Gen Z is willing to spend 30% more, okay, on the same item if the company that they're buying that item from supports a social cause that's important to them. Lastly, they do have quite a bit of buying power, right? So with all of this in mind, I'm going to launch just one more poll. And I want you to take a guess at this. This study was done by a company called WidePulse in May of 2022. So think about timing. And they simply asked, according to Gen Z, what is the biggest problem they say their generation faces today? According to them, what's the biggest problem their generation faces today? We'll give you maybe 10 seconds to do this one because we want to get to the latter part of our conversation. So is it climate change, mental health, social media, COVID, racism, technology, overdependence, or bullying? Cast your vote. And we're going to close it now. All right, let's see what thus say the people, Susan. Okay, so half of us say mental health, 21% say racism, another 21% say climate change, and then bringing up the tail end is social media. All right, let's close it out. I'm going to share with you what the answer is. Here's the answer. Quite interesting, right? Quite interesting. When you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's within the top 3 problems that they believe that their generation faces today. And so when we put our recruiter hat on, or we put our employer branding hat on, or even our product branding or service branding hat on, we think about what it is a community or a population is looking for. How do we begin to think differently about how we engage around these particular items? Racism being a DEI focused, right, problem to really collectively as an organization address. So I'll leave you with that. We don't have time to unpack too deep, but I want to point you to something that I often share with the audiences and groups that I get to work with around what I see as the generational evolution of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. You had Gen X come in and really began, if you will, the conversation began around diversity with the infiltration of Gen X, or the incoming influx of Gen X into the workplace, right? And so Gen X, before Gen X, and a lot of baby boomers are like, hey, we were talking about diversity before Gen X came in. Really, it was about affirmative action, if we recall. It was about EEOC. It was legislatively driven. Gen X came in and said, hey, we need some diversity at this table. We need to be talking about the value of diversity. And so we need this table to be more diverse. And then you had Gen Y, also known as millennials, come to the table and say, hey, it's great that you've got difference at the table, but everybody at this table doesn't have a voice. So we really need inclusion. So the conversation began to evolve to D&I, diversity and inclusion. And now we've got this generation called Gen Z coming to the table and saying, hey, it's great that you've got difference at the table. Also great that you've got voices. Everyone's got a voice at this table. However, I still can't hear a lot of voices because of historical marginalization and oppression and so many other things. And so some of the people at this table need microphones to even be at the same level of vocality, right? And so in that case, we need equity. And so this is where the conversation is evolving. It is now D, E, and I. And really, in a lot of cases, folks are adding the B for belonging, and in some cases, adding the J for justice. And so I want to share with you, as we close out, just one example from a client of mine that shows this very, very clearly. If you think about it, in DEI, we're constantly, or I wouldn't even say in DEI, when it comes to the workplace, speaking about DEI, we constantly use this term, courageous conversation. And I did a video about this probably 2 years ago, and saying that, you know, what's so interesting is the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or inequity, or unbelonging, or exclusion, or racism, or sexism, or classism, or any of the isms is really only courageous for some generations, right? Millennials and Gen Z, many of them don't see these conversations as really all that courageous. They kind of see it as it should be customary, right? But there are other generations who have historically not been able to have these discussions inside of organizations. And so it's been seen as taboo, right? But what we have to ask is, you know, is it really courageous? Should we be getting trophies for having the conversation? I don't know. But here's what I wanted to point to. A client of mine did an employee engagement survey and asked these 2 questions that I'll let you sit with. And I want to just point you to the difference in response based on generation. And it couldn't be more clear, right? When asked if you can really show up authentically to work. 93%, almost 90% cumulatively of boomers said yes. But then you look down at Gen Z and it just matriculates down and down and down and down. Do we value diversity as an organization? The same trend, right? And so my point is, when we are doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, I would suggest and strongly encourage that we're looking at it from a generational lens, because the conversation around DEI is shifting, it's changing, right? Quite frankly, at the end of the day. Last thing I want to share as we invite Jackie on to just have a Q&A for a little while. I was asked, what are some of the common barriers that I see to traction within DEI in a lot of organizations? And I'll leave you with these. Number one thing is mid-managers lacking the knowledge and skill to lead inclusively, right? Lacking the knowledge and the skill to understand this work, to know what their responsibility is, and to know how to do it. So I call that a diversity, equity, and inclusion bottleneck, right? We spend all of this time, energy, and money in our executive leaders, but we negate and neglect to do the same within our mid-level managers, who really drive, if we're honest, a lot of the everyday experience for employees. Senior leaders just not getting it. I can't tell you how much I'm hearing that lately. Developing a DEI strategy and a roadmap has been hard for a lot of organizations. That's because they're often tapping tokens, if you will, inside of organizations to lead diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you need expertise to really drive the development or help in development of DEI strategy and roadmaps. And we can't be tasking folks who have never done DEI work within our organizations because of how they identify to now all of a sudden lead this work, right? Last thing is really about a lack of traction that I'm seeing. And that traction is often coming from either under-resourced DEI efforts. So we're not really providing the resources to really build strategies, et cetera. Tasking a council that has no DEI leadership. So I'm coming across a lot of organizations who, yeah, we've created this council and we've tasked them to go fix it, but there's no DEI leader to really help them do that, or consultancy. And then also I see a lot of organizations putting together employee resource groups with great intention, but those ERGs are lacking clear strategy and guidance. So the efficacy is dwindling, right? And so I'll pause there, I'll end there. There's a lot more that I could share with you and want to share with you, but we just don't have the time to do so. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I'm gonna invite Jackie for maybe a little bit of Q&A.
Well, thank you, Raven. Outstanding update. I took so many notes on what you shared, and I just keep relating back to my own experiences over my multiple careers and my multiple age groups when I was traversing from my 20s through, the plus. So very insightful. I think I'm gonna give you a time to take a break and take a breath. But I reflect myself on several things: the intentionality of the work that organizations have to commit to. Yeah. So you talked about strategy, you talked about integrated approach, but it has to be intentional from all levels. Mm-hmm. In addition, if it doesn't start with leadership, it won't work. Yeah. So the bottoms up, like emergence of expectations or activity, will fail if the leadership doesn't hold the organization accountable and pledge to do that work from a top level. Mm-hmm. And then also just, the ongoing engagement. So one thing about how do you know it's working is how much the stakeholders that receive the DEI strategies and exercises actually think it's doing something. So we move from performative to actually performance, right? And also, instead of making broad public statements, there could be quiet, intentional, and directive action. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of times when we've been in the space of DEI, it becomes almost speak versus action. So it'll be really interesting to hear more about, even the people on the call, what they've seen as things that have worked well and that haven't. And I think the energy has been there at a number of levels, especially in the last 2 years. There's people who are negative and saying it's just going to wane, because once the spotlight gets off of what's happened, people are going to go back to business as usual. Although I have a lot of hope with Generation X and Y, millennials in the workplace, being pronounced on how their expectations should be, listened to that point around what our leader said at the beginning, David. They're not going to settle. And I think their actions are not only speaking up, but walking away.
Yes.
Or not coming on board to begin with. So just smart young people. And I'm retired, so I've been through the exercise of building up DEI programs, supporting them. And to your last point, don't ask amateurs to do this. This is a discipline that should be respected, and experts should be brought in to make sure people recognize their biases and shortcomings, and people can be held accountable for activation. And, you know, the last thing I would say is the organizations that I see holding people accountable for learning and developing, and if they don't meet the criteria, asking them to move along, because they're influencing people. They could be role modeling the wrong behavior. So I always looked at myself as a forever learner and a forever green grower. And if you're not growing, then you're in the way. So I just say that to everyone on the call, that always keep reading and learning. I have evolved into a much bigger student of race relations than ever before. And it's just amazing how much we don't know about our own country. And for the international groups, the same thing. What is the local flavor or experience or history that we have to learn from? So with that, let's get to some questions. All right, let's see if we have any in the queue. I'm going to ask Charlie to help out a little bit so I don't have to multitask too much. Let's talk about some things here. So with your podcast, by the way, which I did take and indulge in. So if you all haven't listened to her, I'm going to plug you, okay, if you don't mind. I'm going to plug your podcast. It's a generational view, Graven Solomon, and it's on my Apple podcast. I'm sure you can get it elsewhere. Very interesting engagement with Gen Zers. I listened to it and I thought these folks are people who are my friends' kids that are in the workplace now. And then right behind that are my teenagers. My son is 19 on Thursday and my daughter is 16, soon to be 17. But with that, it's actually, she's 17. I'm so sorry. She lost track of time. With that, I hear in those podcasts, the voices of these young people. But what I'm startled by is even today, they find themselves in the only positions in their current workplace. So, you know, what expectations should we put on Gen Zers to set expectations for the corporation or talk about DEI openly in the workplace? So it used to be you couldn't talk about race or politics or religion, but these are conversations that are super important now. So what should we put on them to do versus the organization?
Yeah, so when it comes to Gen Z, I think there's a huge opportunity for organizations to leverage their know-how, their knowledge, and to also provide opportunity for them to bring and contribute greatly to this conversation around inclusion. As I mentioned, they have grown up with a level of diversity in many cases that a lot of us have not, right? They talk circles around me oftentimes around gender identity, LGBTQIA plus rights, and so many other things. And so I think organizations stand the opportunity to listen, to learn, to step back, and to allow Gen Zers to kind of help lead these conversations around equity and inclusion. And then I also think, though, we've got to be careful with not tasking them to save the world, right? So many of us are looking to Gen Z as the future of leaders, and we're so happy about their knowledge and boldness and tenacity and so many other things. But, you know, I see a lot of Gen Zers growing frustrated and saying, y'all have all of the wisdom, y'all have all of the relationships, the social capital, the actual capital. Why is it now our responsibility to fix something you've ignored for decades, if not centuries? And they have a point, right? And so I think, you know, I talk a lot about generational diversity and the need for this generational collaboration to solve big, complex problems. And I think racial inequity and exclusion, unbelonging are no different. We need a cross-generational approach because there are plenty of things that boomers and Xers are going to bring to the conversation that millennials and Gen Z cannot, and vice versa. And so I think we've got to be careful about putting the onus and responsibility on Gen Z to save us now, although they're going to be a huge, huge contributor.
Yes, I agree. And I think to the point around being wise and maybe in different parts of the organization, I don't use the word elders, but these other generations are typically in the seats above these Gen Z and X and millennials. Often need to speak up in their own meetings when the younger generation is not there. And I use a term, and I love it because I believe in it. It's reverse mentoring.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I learned so much from my younger employees as I got to be not the youngest in the room, but the oldest in the room. I kept in touch with those emerging leaders and those new hires because they had just a refreshing, different perspective, but didn't really understand the corporate, network matrix ways of working. And so that's where I could help them. But my ears were really open because I was just challenged to think differently around how I saw situations, people. I did learn to listen more because we do all have biases. And so, I remember having to say, yes, I'm the one in charge, not the person next to me that looks different than me. So remember that. But also I would look at people in the room and just assume so many things about them. So the reverse mentoring is so important. I do encourage the younger generations to seek out the elders in the organization to find out how they can help them be more open-minded and provide insight. So that's a great thing. And I agree that those marginalized groups or even the younger generation should not be tasked with educating and getting out resource, documents and books and all those things to help people. I'm happy to share what I've learned, but we've all got to go to the library. We've all got to go online and learn, and we all have to be thoughtful. There's a question in the Q&A, which I love, is you mentioned comfort earlier. And I wrote that down because courageous to customary conversations will make people uncomfortable, and it's okay. But the sense of having a place to be safe, to have conversations is important. Can you talk a little bit about the challenge with working to be comfortable versus courageous?
Yeah. That is a loaded question that I love, and I could talk about that for 45 minutes alone. But you mentioned, I don't know if you said it in this way, but it reminded me, whatever you said reminded me of a growth mindset over a fixed mindset, right? And so it's critical that we approach diversity, equity, and inclusion work and understanding with a growth mindset, right? A fixed mindset would say, I'm uncomfortable here. I need to withdraw myself and go back to where I'm comfortable. A growth mindset would say, I'm uncomfortable here. I'm going to lean into that discomfort, apply courage so that I can get beyond this hump, right? I call them off ramps, which think about ourselves being on this journey to inclusion. If we're behind the wheel of a car and our destination is inclusion, if that's a thing, right? And we're on our way to this destination, there are going to be plenty of off ramps that we can take back towards the space of exclusion. So we can always disengage from this journey. And those off ramps are going to often look like fear, defensiveness, comfort or discomfort rather, overwhelm, guilt. So these emotions that are bound to pop up, the key is us really applying courage in those moments to not be tempted to take the off ramp. I'll talk about it in my forthcoming book, which will come out next year, but those off ramps are going to pop up. Instead of taking the off ramp, it's all right to take a rest stop, right? Because we all know we're on the highway, let's take a rest stop, let's breathe, let's bring it in. But we've got to be careful not to fall captive to those off ramps and say, you know what, I'm going to stay the course. I'm going to stay on the journey, no matter how uncomfortable it is, because I've got a destination.
Yeah, I love that. Or just change lanes.
Change lanes. Absolutely.
Better refuel too. So I like the rest stop idea. But yeah, I think the point around comfort or discomfort or silence. So I just love the quote by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King is, in the end, what we remember is not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And there are so many times where I would be in a meeting and the majority in the room would just be quiet. Especially when we're having these tough conversations about what happened in the last 2 years. And they were there, but they weren't there. And so the challenge is to not allow for silence. And I often encourage my direct reports and those in my team, if you're not comfortable on this call or in this meeting saying something, please come to my office, please call me, let me know how you're feeling. Even if it's uncomfortable or you're just lost, like, I don't even understand what you're talking about. So many people have discovered that they just don't know what has gone on in this country or with other people and some of the things that we've been challenged with in revisionist history, right? So part of this is people are discovering, I didn't learn this in school. Is it true? how could that be? It's not in any books that I've read. So a lot of things that have come out require us to really just reset.
Yeah. Yeah.
Reset.
I call it, this a process of unlearning and relearning. And with this process of unlearning is gonna come some shame and some guilt, right? You're gonna feel those emotions because you're now being enlightened to the fact that what you thought was true is not, and that what you probably thought was always true but did nothing about, there's some guilt associated with that as well. And so pushing past those emotions and applying some courage. Also, might I add, the value in working through those emotions with a therapist, right? Because your diversity, equity, and inclusion leader is not your therapist. Their job is not to necessarily walk you through how to cope with shame and guilt as it relates to your journey towards inclusion. Their job is to help equip you with the skills and the capability and the understanding and the awareness and the guidance, right? And so I would strongly encourage folks to unpack that guilt and shame with a skilled professional.
Oh, that's beautiful. Because, I think what I'm most proud of with this current generation is the openness in talking about mental health. And I think for years it's been taboo. We don't need that. That's for weaklings, or that's a sign of, you don't have a good family. Just all kinds of nonsense. And so we didn't seek the help out that we've needed for decades, like generations. Yeah. And there is a lot of generational heaviness out there. It gets passed along. And so the caution is for, as parents or godparents or aunties or whomever, is not to pass on that heaviness to the new generation, but to let them be innocent for a little bit longer in their own way. I don't mean innocent as in not well read. I mean, keep their energy level up. Don't let them lose momentum to help change the world. It's got to change. So, then a question in that chat is, what do you do when folks want to get that on-ramp going? Like what do you do when you really are in the middle of engagement, or the corporation or organization is, and you see people taking the off-ramp? What is to be done there?
Yeah, I think we have to then understand what it is that motivates the organization and what it is that motivates the individual. Like, I talk a lot about love languages, and then I created this concept called lead languages, which is, a love language is how we best receive love or give love. And then, flipping it on its head, I call a lead language the way in which we best receive leadership or give leadership, right? And so what we have to then figure out, the reason I bring that up is it really is about understanding how people think, how people are motivated, how people are driven, right? And so if we notice that someone has taken an off-ramp of fear, of discomfort, of, defensiveness, et cetera, I think it's about understanding what it is that motivates them to do differently, taking a pause, identifying and acknowledging the fact that they've taken this off-ramp, right? And then utilizing whatever it is that drives or motivates them to get them back on the highway. So for example, in conversations with executive leaders, specifically, this is bias of me, but I will say it, specifically my financial leaders. It's oftentimes the conversation of, this doesn't make financial sense to me. Right. And so I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around this. And there was this one conversation that I was having with a group of senior leaders recently, and the conversation around socialism came up as we were talking about equity. And I would call that the off-ramp of defensiveness, right? Or off-ramp of we're just centering something completely off topic. And so what needed to happen is I had to take a pause, acknowledge the fact that, hey, I can understand how this may be confusing or can be interpreted this way. Let's talk about the difference between socialism and equity, right? Let's unpack why it is that this word kind of bothers you, or what was said that kind of triggered this thought in your mind. Now let's talk about what equity actually is and how it benefits the organization from your perspective. And so it took us a minute. We had to pause the learning experience for about 15 minutes or so, 10 or 15 minutes, but in that case, it was worth it. And so, I guess in summary, I would just say, acknowledge the off-ramp has been taken. Let's name it for what it is, and then figure out, why that off-ramp was taken, but then have the conversation to get them back on using their motivating factors.
Yeah, those, we could talk for hours about that one. It's like a pure legitimate and intentional distraction to get people off center and or gaslight. Like you're just over exaggerating situations. So those are words that I've, noticed that are being used and they're legit because people are quick to make themselves comfortable by pulling the audience away from the hard topic. Okay, so a couple of other questions. I know we're running tight on time, but there's such great questions the audience is asking. What do you think the biggest obstacle or holdback to why employees, leaders or not, do not open up or discuss these types of topics regarding diversity, race, inclusion, et cetera? What's the best way to have them open up? And I will just like to jump in real quick on that one too. I have found, to your point, leadership language. Lead language. Okay, language. I also know people receive things differently, right? So some folks just don't like big forums. They're not going to open up. They're super, quiet about their feelings in general. I found one-on-ones when they're ready. So I literally, when we had office time, always had my door open. And I made these office hours available to my employees, whether it was business or not. It could just be a chat. But I wanted to role model what an open door looked like, and open ears, 2 ears, 1 mouth kind of thing. But with that, I think there are still challenges. So what do you say to that question? How do we start and continue the conversation?
Yeah, I think I kind of look at that question from two different angles. It's either, someone of a marginalized identity racially, so a Black person, another person of color, not really wanting to share and be open about their experiences with racism or anything of the like. And then I think about perhaps someone who's white and who of the racial majority saying, hey, I don't feel comfortable engaging in this conversation. So I think the answer is different depending on which way we're looking at it. I'll assume that we're talking about racially marginalized folks. And so with that, I will tell you just about a quick tool that I use that I think is helpful to help folks assess their relationship with people, to understand perhaps why someone may not be as open as you mentioned. And I call it an emotional bank account, right? So ultimately, if you think about your bank account, right? If I were to go, I bank with PNC. If I go to PNC today and I say, hey, I want to take out $1,000, but I only have $500 in my bank account, they're going to look at me very politely and say, well, Ms. Solomon, I'm sorry, you have not made sufficient deposit to your account to cover the withdrawal that you're trying to make. And I may walk away offended, upset, frustrated, or all the other things, but at the end of the day, they're right. I hadn't made deposits into that bank account to cover what I'm trying to withdraw. And so I use that example to really help folks understand the relationships that they have with the people of different identities in their lives. Each of us has an emotional bank account with everyone in our lives. We make deposits into those emotional bank accounts or withdrawals on a consistent basis. The deposits build trust, establish connection. The withdrawals, they walk away trust, right? And they walk away connection. And so it's important for us to understand before we go and ask folks to share their experiences with racism or classism or sexism or gayism or anything else, what is our balance in our emotional bank account with these individuals, right? Have we made enough deposits to really cover the withdrawal we're trying to make? Because asking someone to share with you their experiences with systemic racism or overt racism, that's a huge withdrawal. That is a traumatic experience for a lot of folks. And if we haven't made enough deposits into that relationship to cover that withdrawal, right, you're going to get an insufficient fund indicator, right? So people are going to say, hey, I don't want to talk about that right now. And it's not reasonable for us to be mad and to disengage and to take an off ramp, right? To take the off ramp of defensiveness or hurt feelings and say, I'm not gonna do this anymore. So I would leave them.
Yeah, I love that. Insufficient funds. I've heard that from someone else very famous. So I think we need to probably wrap up. It's unfortunate because we could just go on for a long time. Maybe we'll have a part 2 here because you've been phenomenal in your wisdom and your approach. And I'm proud of you for walking away from that one client that wasn't engaged. I think that was an example of insufficient funds in so many ways. They were not coming true to their investment. So, and back to the financial people really quickly. I love my financial people. And I would say to them, if they thought it's not worth the investment, then why do we send kids to school? There's no proven outcome until they're actually graduating with a job. It's an ongoing investment, and we need to invest in our employees and our lives in general, and be ever learning. So with that, I think Charlie's popping on for a reason. I think it's time to wrap up, but it's been a pure pleasure, Raven. I hope to see you soon on my next visit to Atlanta. And with that, I will turn it over to Charlie.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you. This has just been a remarkable conversation. And to your point, we could have carried on this discussion for some time to come because of the quality of the content and the quality of the dialogue. And I am have so much respect and appreciation for both of you and what you do, not only in this area, but in other areas to make us a better food system, to make us better people, and to make us a better organization. So thank you for that, because your leadership and your guidance is absolutely crucial. I want to make sure that you, if you're participating today, have the opportunity to continue this conversation as you're absorbing what Raven has to say and the great conversation and dialogue between Raven and Jackie. Sometimes it's difficult to distill what it is you would like to say, or some input you would like to provide, or some questions you would like to ask. So we have the opportunity to continue this conversation where you can process a bit. If you've taken an off ramp, or if you're at the rest stop right now, you'd like to get back on, you can do that through LinkedIn. Share your thoughts on today's dialogue. Tell us what you've learned that can be applied. Tell us what you'd like to hear in other digital dialogues, because we want to make sure that we continue the process as well. There's also a toolkit that's free for any organization or any individual who would like to download it. It's a diversity inclusion discussion toolkit, and it's really designed for frontline supervisors and frontline workers. How do you facilitate those conversations to begin the dialogue? How do you begin that process of opening the highway so people can have that conversation that results in shared understanding that actually promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion? So if you'd like to download that, feel free. If you'd like some help with that, let us know, and we can connect you with individuals who could provide some help with that as well. So again, on behalf of the Center for Food Integrity and FMI, the Food Industry Association, I want to thank our two guests today, Jackie and Raven, for their outstanding content and commentary. And thank you for making time to participate. We look forward to engaging you again in a future dialogue at a future date. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.